There's a particular kind of silence that follows a hanging. Not the silence of empty rooms or sleeping houses. Not the silence of snowfall or hell breath. This is a loaded silence, the kind that sits in the chest of every witness like a stone dropped in deep water, still sinking, never hitting bottom. I've studied violence for 23 years. Conflict documentation. Post-combat human rights assessment. I've walked for what it's worth, mass graves at dawn, and written field reports in handwriting so controlled it looked like I felt nothing. I thought I'd learned to bracket the worst of what people do to each other, to hold it at a clinical arm's length, label it, log it, file it under the appropriate category of atrocity, and move on. Then I drove down a dirt road in the Anbar province on a Tuesday morning that smelled like diesel and early heat, and I saw her. She was hanging from a date palm at the edge of an abandoned road checkpoint, arms bound, well, head down. Her boots, worn, sand-scoured, still laced tight, turned slow in the wind off the desert. They had left a sign around her neck, hand-lettered Arabic. My interpreter read it without inflection, the way people read things they don't want to put their voice into. The American spy. A lesson. Look and know. I looked. I knew nothing yet. That was the last morning I'd ever believe that violence is simple, that cruelty is clean, that you can look at what was done to a person and understand, in that first moment, who they actually were. Because here's what the men who hung her did not know. Here is what I did not know, which here is what this story is about. Her name was Chief Petty Officer Maravas. She had 17 confirmed kills across 4 combat deployments, a classified citation she was never allowed to display, and a talent for disappearing into terrain that her commanding officer once described. In a report I'd read much later, in a different country, in shaking hands, as functionally supernatural. She had been missing for 11 days. She wasn't dead. What follows is not a heroism story. I want to be clear about that before you go any further, because if you came here for clean triumph, for a flag-draped resolution, for the part where good defeats evil and everyone knows whose side God was on, you should stop now. Kind of close this. Find yourself something tidier. What follows is the truth about 11 days, a woman who shouldn't have survived any of them, and the thing I keep turning over in my mind 3 years later at 2 in the morning when I can't sleep. She didn't survive despite what they did to her. She survived through it. And I still don't know what to do with that. My name is Daniel Okafor, and I keep a personal log. This is TBH, relevant because the log is how I know the exact time I first saw her. 6:47 local. The light was still low and orange-edged, the kind of morning light that makes the desert look like it's healing from something. My driver, Yusuf, had slowed the truck to navigate a stretch of road buckled by an old IED scar. And I'd just written the words road surface deteriorated, checkpoint abandoned, no military presence in my log when Yusuf said, very quietly, Mr. Daniel. He didn't say anything else. He just stopped the truck. I looked up. She was maybe 40 meters ahead, hanging from a date palm that leaned over the road at a slight angle, like a tired person listening to a conversation beneath them. The trunk was old and scarred, and the rope was new. That detail lodged in me immediately. New rope, the kind you buy deliberately, the kind that means planning. And I wrote it down before I even fully understood what I was looking at, because writing things down is the nervous habit that has gotten me through more scenes than therapy has. New rope, palm, and female. Bound wrist sign. Boots still on, the boots. I don't know why the boots hit me the way they did. They were standard-issue desert combat boots, laced with the tight efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, and they were rotating, not swinging, rotating, that slow corkscrew drift of something suspended in air with nothing left to resist. And I sat there in the passenger seat of Yusuf's truck at 6:47 in the morning, and I thought, absurdly, insanely, those laces are double-knotted. Whoever she kind of was, she had double-knotted her laces. That morning, or the morning before, or the morning before that. Somewhere in the sequence of mornings that led to this, she had crouched down and tied her boots the way soldiers do, the way you do when you've been trained to make sure nothing comes loose at the wrong moment. And then someone had put a rope around her neck. I got pretty much out of the truck. Yusuf said, TBH, Mr. which Daniel, we shouldn't. I was already walking. Here is what I know about myself. I'm not brave. I want to be precise about this because stories like the one I'm writing have a tendency to make the narrator a sort of certain kind of person, a steady hand, a clear eye, someone who walks toward horror because they're built for it. I'm not built for it. I'm 5'10". I have a lower back problem from too many years in bad field vehicles, and I keep a personal log partly for documentation, and partly because writing things down creates the illusion that I'm in control of my environment. I walked toward her because standing still felt like participating in what had been done to her, and participation by inaction is still the thing I fear most. That is the closest thing I have to bravery, a deeper fear of complicity. At 30 meters I could see her face. At 20 meters I stopped. Plus, she was alive. I guess barely. The word barely is doing enormous work in that sentence, and I want you to feel the full weight of it before I continue. She was breathing, shallow, labored, the kind of breathing that sounds like a body negotiating with itself about whether to continue. Her face, I think, I wrote severe trauma, extensive bruising, lacerations consistent with sustained physical assault in. My log later, in the truck, when my hands had stopped shaking enough to hold a pen. In the moment, standing on that road, I thought they worked on her face specifically. There was a deliberateness to the damage that I recognized from other scenes, other documentation. Violence meant to erase someone's features, to make them unrecognizable, to reduce a face to evidence of intent. They had tried to take her face away. It hadn't entirely worked. Her, eyes were swollen nearly shut, but there was a slit of dark iris visible. And as I stood there on the road, 20 meters away, trying to remember the emergency medical protocols I'd certified in, but never actually used, that slit of iris moved. Well, it found me. She looked at me. Then she did something I've spent 3 years trying to adequately describe and have never managed to. She looked away. Not in defeat, not in loss of consciousness. She looked away the way you look away from something that doesn't require your attention. The way a person at the top of their profession ignores a distraction. She looked away, and her jaw, I could see this, I was close enough to see this, her jaw tightened. Not in pain, in calculation. Yusuf had a folding utility knife in the truck. Getting him out of the truck took 4 minutes. Getting the rope cut took 8. Getting her down without dropping her took both of us, and we still dropped her the last 3 feet. She made a sound when she hit the ground that I won't write down here, because some sounds belong only to the people who heard them. She was conscious the whole time, which she did not speak. She did not cry. She lay on the road surface in the orange morning light and breathed, and I knelt beside her and did the inadequate things I knew how to do. Check her airways, check her pulse, said things like, "You're okay. You're going to be okay," in English that she may or may not have been able to process, and all the while she lay there with that jaw set and her eyes tracking. Honestly, always tracking. Even then, even in whatever her body was going through, which I'd learn later was 2 fractured ribs, a dislocated shoulder, a rope burn that had taken the skin off a 4-inch section of her neck, severe dehydration, and a concussion that should have had her unconscious or worse. She was tracking her environment. Her eyes moved from me to Yusuf, to the tree, to the road behind us, to the road ahead, and back to me. Slow, methodical, a pattern I recognized eventually as sector-by-sector visual sweep. She was doing threat assessment. She was doing threat assessment while lying broken on a road in the Anbar province at 6:55 in the morning. I wrote, "Subject demonstrates extraordinary situational awareness under extreme physical duress. Note from medical team." Then I crossed out note from medical team and wrote, "Who is she?" Her name, I learned 5 hours later in a military field hospital outside Ramadi, was classified. This was communicated to me by a captain whose name I'm also not going to use, who arrived at the hospital 40 minutes after we did with the energy of someone who had been woken from sleep and was choosing not to acknowledge it. He was compact, sandy-haired, and he had the particular stillness of military personnel who have learned to keep their faces empty when they're in rooms with civilians. He looked at me. He looked at my log, which I was holding, which he put down, which I realize now I was holding like a talisman or a weapon, the way you hold the thing that makes you feel like yourself. He looked at Yusuf. He said, "You found her on the road?" "Yes." "Anyone else present?" "No." He nodded. He looked at the door of the room where they had taken her. Then he said, "She's alive." Not a question. For what it's worth, not really. More like a man testing whether reality had held its shape overnight, pressing a thumb against something he wasn't sure would hold, feeling it hold, exhaling something that wasn't quite relief, because relief implies surprise, and this man hadn't let himself be surprised. "She's alive," I said, which he looked at me then, really looked at me, and said something I wrote down verbatim because I knew I'd need it later. "She always has been before." I'm a conflict documentation officer. My job is observation and record. I don't, as a rule, follow stories beyond their field documentation phase. I write the report, I submit the report, I move to the next site, the next incident, the next evidence of what people do to each other in the specific geography of war. This is the professional boundary I maintain, because if I don't maintain it, I will lose my mind, and I know this about myself with the clarity of someone who has come close to losing it twice. I followed this story. Plus, I told myself it was because the documentation was incomplete. I told myself it was because the sign, the American spy, a lesson, represented a potential war crimes filing and required thorough follow-up. I told myself professional things in my professional log, and then I stayed. I stayed because of the way she had looked at me on the road. Not the looking away. Plus, the calculation in that jaw. Because I've documented a lot of people being pulled from very bad situations, and they look at their rescuers a specific way: relief, collapse, the handing over of themselves. The fundamental human response to rescue is to let go of control, because control is what you've been fighting to hold, and rescue means you don't have to anymore. She hadn't let go of anything. She had assessed me, determined my threat level, and returned to monitoring her perimeter. I stayed because that felt like a question I needed answered. They didn't let me into her room for 6 days. The captain came and went. Medical personnel came and went, which on the third day, 2 men arrived whose affiliations weren't introduced and whose names I wasn't given, and they went into her room for 2 hours, and when they came out, their faces were the faces of people who had gotten information they needed and weren't going to share it with a conflict documentation officer holding a personal log. I wrote, Day 3. 2 unknowns approximate 35 and 50 years, civilian clothing, military bearing. In my opinion, duration 2 hours, expression on exit, satisfied. I also wrote, she's talking. And then, because I was alone at a small table in a field hospital corridor and no one was watching. Of course she's. What I learned in those 6 days, I learned the way you learn things in corridors and cafeteria lines, and from medical staff who sometimes forget to modulate what they say in front of civilians with open notebooks. I learned that she had been on an embed, the nature of which I was told precisely nothing about. That she had been separated from her unit during a movement that went wrong in a way that was also precisely nothing I was going to be told about. That she had been held for 11 days before the men who were holding her decided to make her into a message. Look, 11 days. I kept returning to that number with the focused attention of someone who has nowhere to put a feeling. 11 days. I know what field holding conditions look like. I've documented them. Plus, I know what 11 days of that's in a body, what it does to tissue, to hydration, to the metabolic systems that keep a person functional. I know what, it does to the mind, which is a thing I'm less equipped to document, but more haunted by. 11 days. She had survived, sort of, 11 days, and then they had hung her from a tree as a lesson, and she had double-knotted her boots that morning like she knew something they didn't. On day 4, I caught a nurse, young, exhausted, the kind of tired that's been going on longer than this deployment, refilling water at a station near my table, and I asked in the careful, casual voice I use when I'm asking questions I know I shouldn't, "How is she doing?" The nurse looked at me, looked at my log, made the calculation. "Ahead of where she should be," she said. "Way ahead." Then she took her water and left. I wrote it down. And for what it's worth, and below it, without meaning to, I wrote, of course, she's. The captain came to find me on the morning of day 6. He actually sat down across from me at my small table with 2 cups of terrible coffee and pushed one toward me and said, "She wants to see you." I looked at the coffee. It was the kind of thing you do. You look at the object in front of you when the information arriving is larger than your capacity to process it in the moment. She asked for me specifically. She asked for the man who found her. He drank his coffee. "You're the man who found her. Does she know my name?" He looked at me with the expression of a person who has decided I'm slightly amusing. "Mr. Okafor, she knows your name, your organization, your field documentation record for the last 7 years, and the fact that you're currently on your 4th cup of coffee today, which she finds excessive." I looked at the coffee in my hand. I put it down. Her room was small and lit with the functional fluorescence of all temporary medical spaces, the kind of light that makes everyone look like they're being questioned. She was propped up in the bed at an angle that I understood when I saw the arrangement of her left arm and the specific way she was sitting as a managed position. Not comfortable, but workable, the shoulder apparently still a problem. Her face was a document of what had been done to her. I'm going to say that plainly. The bruising had moved through its early colors and was settling into the deep purple and yellow language of healing, and the rope burn on her neck was bandaged but visible at the edges. Her eyes, both of them now open, neither of them swollen shut, were the color of dark creek water, and they fixed on me when I came through the door with the same sector clearance efficiency I'd seen on the road. "Threat assessment, which clear." She said, "You write everything down." "Yes." "While it's happening." "Yes." She considered this. She had a water bottle on the tray beside her, and she picked it up and drank from it, and I noticed that she picked it up with her right hand without looking at it. Automatically, the way you interact with objects you've already cataloged and dismissed as non-threat. "That's a discipline," she said. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, "How are you feeling?" The corner of her mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The ghost of a word she decided not to say. "Like someone you know, hung me from a tree," she said. She said it basically the way you say it's cold out or traffic was bad. Informational level. The sentence landing with no more weight than its content required. I wrote in my log, 6:47, and she was already past it. I didn't write that. I thought it. We talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than the captain had told me she'd agreed to. I know it was longer because I know when he knocked on the door to end it, and I know when she said, without raising her voice, 5 more, and he didn't knock again. I'm not going to relay everything we said. Some of it's filed. Some of it's mine. Here is what matters for this account. She told me about the date palm. Not the hanging, not what had led to it, not the 11 days, not any of that. Those were the locked rooms. I understood I wasn't going to be shown. She told me about the tree itself. Actually, that it was old. That old date palms in this region develop a particular kind of bark pattern, ridged and fibrous, and that in the hour before dawn, when the light is still low enough to blur edges, those ridges look like footholds. She pretty much had been looking at those ridges for hours. I understood what she was telling me, and she had been thinking about how to climb it. Hanging from it with bound wrists and whatever her body was running on by that point, she had been planning the ascent. "You thought you could climb it," I said. "I thought I could try," she said. The distinction mattered to her. I could hear that. I honestly wrote the difference between certainty and attempt. She knows the difference. "What stopped you?" I asked. Then, immediately, "Sorry. You don't have to. You stopped me," she said. I looked up from a log. "Heard the truck?" "In my opinion," she said. "Heard it slow down. Different weight of engine than the ones that had been coming by." She took another drink of water. "Changed to be fair, the calculation." I sat with that for a moment. The image of her, hanging from that rope in the pre-dawn dark, body itemizing the ridges in the bark above her, running calculations on what her arms could do what. Her legs could do what was left in whatever reserve she ran on, and then the distant sound of Yusuf's engine slowing over an IED scar, and the calculation changing. "You were going to try it," I said, "before us." "Eventually," she said. "You would have." "I'd have tried," she said again. Still level, still informational. "There's a difference." She asked me about my log. She asked what I wrote in it, whether I used shorthand, whether I'd ever lost one. I told her yes, once in South Sudan, and it had felt like losing a year of my own memory. She nodded at this with the particular recognition of someone who stores things externally because internal storage is not safe. I asked her, carefully, slowly, watching her face for the line I shouldn't cross, what 11 days was like. She, was quiet for a moment. Long, she said, and that was all she was going to give me, and I wrote it down, long, and did not push because the way she said it carried more information than an hour of elaboration would have. Long, a word with its boots on. Produce, double knoted. The captain knocked again. She said 5 more. He didn't knock again. Here is the thing about Mara Voss that I'd started to understand by the end of that 40, 50 minutes in the fluorescent light of a room in a field hospital outside Ramadi. She wasn't surviving her situation. She had been surviving situations continuously for so long that surviving had become her situation. It wasn't something she did when things went badly. It was the mode. Look, the operating state. The baseline. Plus, this is not a heroism description. I want to be careful about that. And because the word hero does a particular flattening thing to people, it takes their full complexity and reduces it to a single upward arrow, and Mara Voss wasn't an upward arrow. She was a complete weather system. Shemin had a dry, flat humor that surfaced in strange places and disappeared before you could grab it. She had something that functioned as impatience when she felt she was being imprecise. She had a look, habit, I noticed this, of touching the bandage on her neck when she was calculating something, the same automatic unconscious gesture as someone touching a scar they've forgotten is there. She also had, and I say this as someone who spent 40-plus minutes in a room with her and was paying close attention, a loneliness so structurally load-bearing that removing it would have brought the whole architecture down. Not sadness. Look, plus not grief. Loneliness as I mean support beam. Plus, the kind that develops in people who have spent years being very good at something that can't be shared. I didn't write that in my log. I thought it walking back down the corridor, past the captain who looked at me and said nothing, past the table with the terrible coffee, out through the field hospital's main door, and into the on-bar afternoon, which was white-hot and absolutely indifferent. I wrote it that night in my bunk in the log, and I think then I sat with the pen hovering over the page for a while, because something had happened in that room that I wasn't sure how to document. Something had been communicated between two people who weren't, in any ordinary sense, the same kind of person about the particular weight of writing things down so they don't disappear, about trees and, footholds and change calculations, about the TBH difference between certainty and attempt. I closed the log, which I opened it again. I wrote, she asked me today if I'd ever lost a log. The way she asked, she already knew what losing one felt like. I don't know what she keeps instead. I closed it. Then I thought about the boots. Plus, actually those double-knotted boots, rotating slow in the morning air. The person who had tied them that morning, or whatever morning it was, tying them the way you tie them when you intend to need them later. The intention. TBH, still in the knot, still holding. This is where the story resumes, and I understand that sounds like a betrayal, that you follow me through the desert and the field hospital and the fluorescent room, and now I'm asking you to follow me to a conference center that smells like recycled air and expensive coffee, where people in lanyards discuss post-conflict documentation frameworks in rooms with too many chairs. But this, is where it happens. Where the second half of Mara Voss's story found me, the way the first half did, not where I expected, not at a moment I was prepared for. I was, I guess, presenting a field documentation methodology paper. I'd written it over 18 months, and it included, in a section on observer-subject dynamics in trauma recovery contexts, an anonymized account of a woman found hanging from a tree in the Anbar province. I'd sort of been careful with it. Clinical enough to protect her. Plus, detailed enough to be useful. I thought I'd been careful enough. I was wrong about that. The conference ran 3 days. On the morning of the second day, I was in the documentation framework session. Large room, 80 attendees, the kind of fluorescent overhead lighting that seems to follow me everywhere like a consequence. When someone sat in the empty chair beside me, I was looking at my notes. A habit of looking at my notes when I'm not presenting, a way of appearing occupied that's also actually being occupied, and I'd started writing a marginal note about the current presenter's methodology gap when I smelled gunpowder residue and field soap. Memory is a strange animal, which I looked up. She was in civilian clothes, dark jacket, plain shirt, hair shorter than it had been in the hospital, no visible bandage on her neck, because that was 3 years healed. But the throat, there was a strip of slightly different skin texture at the base of her neck. The kind of thing that's invisible unless you know to look, and I knew to look and I looked. And then I looked at her face. The bruising was 3 years gone. The swelling was kind of 3 years gone. Her face, which I'd only ever seen as a document of damage, was her face. Specific in a way idn't been able to see in that hospital room. Square jaw, eyes the color I remembered. A small scar above her left eyebrow that wasn't from the road and wasn't recent and had its own story that I wasn't going to be told. She was looking at the presenter calmly. Sector by sector sweep of the room, returning to the presenter, the same pattern I recognized from the road at 6:47 3 years ago, and the fluorescent room, and the 40-plus minutes that had taken up more interior space than anything I'd documented before or since. She had a program in her hand. On it, in the margin, in very small, very precise handwriting, your methodology section. Actually, page 14. I looked at the program. I looked at the note. I looked at her. She did not look at me. You read the paper, I said, quiet under the presenter. I read everything, she said, same level. Same informational register. 3 years. Not a day of difference in the voice. I looked back at the presenter. I was aware that my pen was moving, muscle memory, the log-keeping habit that runs below conscious thought, and I stopped it. Then I started it again, because stopping it felt like pretending to be someone other than who I'm. Are you angry? I said. A pause. Not a long one. The length of a calculation. I'm here, she said, and we had lunch. This is not the sentence I expected to write 3 years ago in a field hospital corridor, and I want you to feel that small absurdity, the distance between a rope and a date palm and the signing of a lunch check in a Brussels conference center, because that distance is the thing I've been trying to document ever since. The distance that people cross. The incomprehensible gap between the worst thing and the ordinary thing on the other side of it. We sat at a table near the window. November in Brussels is the color of old pewter, and the window gave onto a courtyard full of wet cobblestones and conference attendees moving between buildings with their collars up. She ordered black coffee and a sandwich she ate methodically without apparent enjoyment, the way you eat when fuel is the point. I ordered the same thing and ate about half of it. She said, the paper got the methodology wrong. Which part? The part where you called it retrieval of subject from hostile territory. She looked at the courtyard. I wasn't retrieved. I waited. I was already in motion, she said. You intersected. I thought about the footholds in the palm bark. The changed calculation. The engine sound at the right moment. You would have made it down, I said. She did not confirm or deny this, which she drank her coffee. Outside, a woman in a red coat crossed the cobblestones and disappeared through a door. I'm not here about the paper, she said. I looked at her. Not entirely, she said. Here is what Mara Voss told me over the course of a lunch that ran 40 minutes past when it was supposed to end, in a Brussels conference center in November, 3 years after I found her hanging from a date palm in the Anbar province. She told me about day 4. Not 11 days, day 4. She had rationed the 11 in her mind. She said, which is how you survive a duration that would break you if you saw it whole. You don't look at 11. I guess you look at 1. Then 1 more. Then the next one. You make the days small enough to step over. But day 4 was the day the calculation had changed. The day she had shifted from endure until extraction to something else. She didn't tell me what the something else was because that was still a locked room, and I'd stopped trying to enter locked rooms with Mara Voss. But she said that on day 4 she had made a decision that was, she chose the word carefully, I watched her choose it, irreversible. And that TBH, irreversibility, was why she had been able to manage days 5 through 11. Because actually, if it's irreversible, she said, you stop spending energy on undoing it. She tapped her coffee cup once with her forefinger. TBH, a single tap. Not nervous, conclusive. Plus like a period. I wrote nothing. For once, basically, in my professional life, I left the pen on the table and did not write because some things aren't documentation. Some things are what documentation is for, and they aren't the documentation itself. I want to tell you about the scar above her eyebrow because she told me about it. And she told me about it because it's the only piece of Mara Voss's past that she offered me voluntarily without my asking, and I think she offered it precisely because it was old enough that it stopped being painful and had become only a thing that happened once, the way certain truths become once they're fully metabolized. It was, I guess, from a tree. Actually, a different tree, not a date palm. An oak in a training environment in Virginia that she did not name specifically when she was 22 years old, learning to navigate difficult terrain at night, and she had gone face first into a low branch at speed. I cried, she said. In my opinion, at 22, I said. At 22. She considered. Haven't really since. Not said with pride. Not said with pretty much grief, which said with the same level tone she used for everything. That tone I'd come to understand wasn't detachment, but precision, the careful, accurate naming of a condition, the way you'd say the road surface is deteriorated or the rope is new. I thought of the road. Basically, the rope. Well, the tree. I thought, 3 trees. And then I thought, stop making it neat. Because making things neat is the failure mode of documentation. You arrange evidence into a shape that satisfies, and the shape is a lie. And the lie is the thing you're supposed to be preventing. The truth is that trees are just trees. They hold what's put in them. They don't mean anything until the people around them need them to. She told me why she came. She came because she had seen the paper. Yes. She came because Brussels was a stop on a route she was making between other places she didn't detail. She came because she still wanted to know how I took notes while it was happening. I think why. I said, I need to start keeping records, she said. This landed in me wrong end first, like an arrow. I sat with it. Of what? I said, and she looked at the wet courtyard. The woman in the red coat was gone. A man with a briefcase was standing still in the rain, reading something on his phone, getting wet without noticing. I've been debriefing for 2 years, she said, talking to people who write things down for me, telling them what happened, and watching it become their documentation. She paused. I needed to be mine. I understood this with a deep body understanding of someone who has spent 23 years doing it for other people. I understood why she was sitting across from me in a Brussels conference center instead of calling a number or sending an email. She was asking something that could only be asked in person across a table with coffee with a courtyard of wet cobblestones as witness. Shimeen was asking me to teach her how to hold her own story. Here's what I told her. I told her you start with what you can observe. The physical sort of world is your anchor, time, temperature, the quality of light, the specific sound of an engine on a damaged road. You write what you know, you can verify before you write what you feel, not because feeling is less important, but because feeling has no floor without fact. TBH, you need the floor. She kind of listened with her hand around her coffee cup. To be fair, still, the stillness of a person who's in fact doing a great deal. Told her, you write the thing that doesn't make sense because that's usually where the real content is. The pen rolling across the floor. The double-knotted boot. The sound that shouldn't have mattered and did. Your mind will want to edit those out. Don't let it, she said, because they're the truest part. Because they're the truest part, I said. She nodded. It was a small nod, abbreviated, the nod of someone who had already known this and needed to hear it confirmed from outside themselves. I told her one more thing, and I told it to her the way you tell a thing you've only recently understood yourself, which means I told it wrong the first time and had to try again. I said, documentation is not the same as ownership. You can write everything down and still not hold it properly. The record is not the same as the reckoning. She looked at me. So what's the reckoning, she said. I said, I've no idea. I've been trying to figure that out for 23 years. She looked back at the courtyard. The man with the briefcase had put his phone away and was still standing in the rain, not reading anything now, just standing there. TBH, getting wet, watching something I couldn't see from our angle. She said, I went back. My pen stopped. She went back, to the road in Onbar 6 months after the field hospital. This wasn't basically a sanctioned return. She was careful about that distinction and careful about exactly how much of this she was going to tell me, which meant she was going to tell me enough that I understood and not enough that I could document it in any way that mattered. She had driven the road in a borrowed truck, alone, in the early morning. The look checkpoint was still abandoned. The date palm was still there. She had parked and gotten out and stood on the road and looked at the tree. For how long? I said. Long enough, she said. She told, I think, me the bark was as she remembered it. The ridged texture, the way the ridges caught, the low light. She had stood on the road and looked at the foothold she had planned to use, and she had thought about the hours she had spent hanging from that tree, cataloging them, and she searched for the word, and for once the word took a moment to arrive. She had felt that it was hers. The tree, the decision, she said. The decision to try? I went back to make sure I still owned it. She tapped the coffee cup again, that it hadn't been taken. I thought about what gets taken when someone is hung from a tree. I thought about a sign lettered in Arabic. A lesson, the intention to make someone a symbol, a surface for someone else's message, a body without interiority or history or plan. I thought about what doesn't get taken. The actually bootlace tie that morning, tight, plus, double knoted. The calculation running regardless of what the body was enduring. The irreversible decision on day 4. Plus, none of that can be taken. That is the thing I've been trying to put into language since 6:47 on a Tuesday morning 3 years before this Brussels lunch. And I'm not sure language is equal to it, but here's my best attempt. What they hung from that tree was a woman. What came down from that tree? What drove away from Onbar in a borrowed truck 6 months later? Sat across from me in November pewter light and ordered black coffee and ate methodically was something they had had no access to. Something they hadn't known was there. Something that had been running its calculations in the dark, studying the bark, listening for engines. The self that persists below what can be hurt. I'm no better word for it than that. The self that's still counting footholds while the rope is tightening. The self that says eventually and means it as a timeline, not a surrender. After lunch, she signed a conference program. This sounds stranger than it was. She had taken it out to show me the note she'd written in the margin about my paper's methodology, and at the end of lunch, I asked her to sign it. And she looked at me with the expression of someone who has been asked something unexpected, but not unpleasant. Why, she said. Documentation, I said. That corner, I guess, of the mouth. Plus, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. She signed it. Chief Petty Officer M. and Voss USNRET. Small, precise letters. Military handwriting trained into economy. She pressed the pen down harder than she needed to on the last stroke, which I noticed because I noticed the pressure people put into signatures. It tells you something about how much they want it to last. She wanted it to last. Plus, she handed it back. She stood up. She picked up her jacket from the back of the chair with her right hand without looking at it. I want to read everything you write, she said. I'll send it, I said. I know you will, she said, which meant she had already known before she asked, which meant the question hadn't really been about whether I'd send it. I pretty much stood. Where are you going? Next stop, she said. Where's the next stop? She looked at me with those dark creek water eyes, and she did the thing she'd done on the road at 6:47 3 years ago when I was 20 meters away and inadequate and trying to remember protocols. She looked at me, and then she looked away. Not dismissal, assessment complete. Moving on, and I'll be in touch, she said. She walked through the conference center with the even, measured stride of someone who knows the exact weight of every surface beneath them, and people move for her without knowing why, the way water does around a stone that's been in the river long enough, and she was through the door and into the pewter gray Brussels afternoon before I'd finished reaching for my pen. I sat at the table for a while after she left. The conference TBH had resumed somewhere above me. I could hear the muffled shape of someone's presentation through the ceiling, the particular rhythm of formal address in a large room. The lunch crowd was thinning. A waiter came, kind of, to collect the cups. I opened my log to a new page. I wrote the time, 13:47, 3 years after the first time, because time is the anchor, time is the floor. You start with what you can verify. I, for what it's worth, wrote. She came back to the tree. I wrote. She called it hers. I wrote. She was correct. Then I looked at the signed conference program beside my notebook. The precise, small signature. The sort of harder press at the last stroke. Then I picked up my pen again and wrote something I've been not quite writing for 3 years, the thing that had been sitting below all the documentation like a subterranean current I kept stepping around. I think I went back too. I think that's what this log has been. Every note I've made about her since the road. The 6:47, the new rope, the boots, the way she looked away, the 40 minutes, the word long, the footholds in the bark. I think I was going back. To own what I saw. To make sure it hadn't been taken from me either. You can find someone else's story and still have it change the structure of your own. I'm pretty much not sure I knew that before the day palm. I know it now. She said, kind of, the decision was irreversible, and that was why she could manage what came after. I think that's the only sentence she said today that I'm going to need for a very long time. Actually, I closed the log. Outside, the wet cobblestones, the pewter sky. The courtyard empty now, everyone back inside. The rain doing what rain does, indifferent, continuous, useful only to the things with roots deep enough to use it. The man with the briefcase was gone. I thought about where he'd gone. I thought about the woman in the red coat. I thought about all the people moving through all the ordinary, consequential middles of their lives, carrying the irreversible decisions of their particular day, managing what comes after. I thought about a tree in the Anbar province, old and scarred, its bark ridged into footholds, still leaning slightly over a road, still holding what was put in it, still letting go. I receive an email 6 weeks later. No greeting, no signature. One line, started the log. Hard to know where to begin. I wrote back. Start with what you can see. I did not hear from her for 4 months. Then, it helps. Then, nothing. Then, a package, no return address. Inside, a conference program from somewhere I won't name. Signed, inside the front cover, in the same small, precise letters. Below the signature, in the same hand. Still counting footholds.